Hi guys, Mr. Talbot here for you. Going to give you a little rundown on the Mexican Revolution, which is hopefully going to help you with this project, kind of hopefully making some of the connections that we've talked about with the Enlightenment, with nationalism, to a lesser degree industrialization, but also we're going to look at imperialism. So be kind of keeping an eye out for some of those different connections that we might see. So let's think about kind of what's going on in Mexico at this time. So Mexico is going to be, the home of many of the largest indigenous cultures of the Americas. So you're talking about the Aztec and the Maya in particular. Then come the 1500s, is when Cortez and the conquistadors come. And they're going to take and they're going to steal the gold from the Americans. And that's going to kind of help boost Spain into becoming a dominant world power. But because Spain's able to get all this money from just getting the gold and not really having to do a lot of work for it, they're not going to modernize their economy like we're going to see in England. And as a result, Spain's not going to industrialize for a while, and Mexico's economy is not going to develop along with it either. Because of the missionaries that came with the conquistadors, the Catholic Church becomes really, really powerful. Um, and the other really powerful group are wealthy, what are called Creoles or Peninsulares. And we'll talk about them more in a little bit. But essentially, either the Catholic Church or a conquistador or its descendants often got the money in Mexico and also got the land in Mexico. So most of the land is owned by these, Creoles or the Catholic Church. Now, in the case of Creoles or Peninsulares, they own these things called haciendas. And the haciendas we'll look at more in a second are is a Spanish word for for plantation. So these are the large agriculture systems in Mexico. Now, because these groups of people have been given this land, again, we're not going to see the modernizing of the agriculture like we're going to see in England. And as a result, Mexico is going to kind of stay behind. Spain's going to kind of fall behind England. And so, because of the Spanish influence and because the Native American populations, the indigenous people of Mexico, they're wiped out a lot by disease, but many do remain. We're going to see a blending of culture and kind of what we think of Mexican culture today with mariachi, with the food, with the clothing, in a much bigger way than we see in the United States. The United States really didn't take on too much Native American culture. We do see that take place in Mexico. And so this would be the hacienda system. Um, and in the haciendas, you would have a lot of times these were large plantations, owned by a former conquistador or its descendants. These things were massive a lot of times, and a lot of the workers were, the former indigenous population, because you're not going to see a big influx of African slaves here. So the indigenous population, the peasant class, are really forced to stay on the land and don't really leave it. So it's very similar to like feudal Europe. And it's essentially a form of slavery because you would be told, oh, you're working for this person and we'll pay you, but you've got to buy all your goods from us. You've got to pay us rent. And oh, just so happens we don't pay you quite enough to make do every month. So now you're in debt. Now you're stuck here. And that's kind of the way the system would work. So you have this huge class of people that was, would rise up in the case of a revolution. Um, but then you have another group that we're going to talk about, and that other group is the Creoles. So when the Spanish set up the system in Mexico, it was very much based on racial hierarchy, and it's called the Casta system. But in addition to being based on race, where people from the Spanish Peninsula are, at the top, and people from Africa and the indigenous are lower on the scale, um, you're going to see that it's also where you're born. So a peninsulare is someone that's born on the Iberian Peninsula, so born in Spain. Um, Whereas a Creole is ethnically the exact same, 100% Spanish in their ethnicity, but they were born in Mexico or born in somewhere in the Americas, and so they would be called the Creole. And you can kind of see as you go down, complexion gets darker. Africans are viewed at the very bottom, but then you have your full-blooded Indians as well. But there's a lot of mixed race people here, so they actually devise all this different. So a very, very rigid social structure. And a Creole is someone who ethnically looks the exact same as a Peninsulari. Economically, they're probably just as well off, but they don't have any political power, or not certainly as much as they would want. So this is very similar to the bourgeois in France. A wealthy group, a powerful group, or wants to be a powerful group, but doesn't have that political power. and they're going to be able to become the leaders, just like the bourgeois are in France. But it's really the lower classes that are going to rise up and do a lot of the fighting in Mexico at this time. So this is a famous painting in Mexico City, and it's a mural that kind of takes you through the history of Mexico from um, the being imperialized by the conquistadors all the way through to the War of Independence and the Mexican Revolution. So one kind of cool thing about this is if you look at it, it starts dark over here during the imperial colonial phase, becomes lighter as we get into the revolution, or sorry, into the War of Independence, which is led by this character here named Father Hidalgo. You're going to see a wealthy Creole is going to be, according to the artist, helping these Native Americans and these lower class peasants along the way. Again, the Creoles are the leaders, but they're going to rely upon the fighting of the peasant class and the indigenous class. And then as we get over here into the revolution, which is what your topic's going to be on, we're going to see the fighting and creating kind of the modern Mexico that we know of today. So none of this stuff happens in a bubble. So the initial leader is a Catholic priest named Father Hidalgo. Um, he really used religion as a unifying force for the Mexican people, and saying we live here, we should not be ruled by what's going on over someone over in Europe. So very much influenced by nationalism, and then later we're going to see some influences of the Enlightenment here. Um, and we're going to see when Mexico declares its independence in 1813, Mexico is going to be a republic. They're going to abolish slavery, and they're going to eliminate that social class system. At least that's what they're going to try to do. But you can really see the influence of the Enlightenment there. Additionally, Mexico is going to fight for its independence at the same time Simon Bolivar is kind of unifying the rest of Latin America. So this idea of nationalism is also really influential. And amidst all this, you've got drama with Napoleon and stuff that's going to kind of lead to France, or sorry, Spain having less influence in Mexico. And that's going to switch back and forth. I'm not going to get into that, but that does have an influence as well. So Mexico has, kind of three phases. We talked about the Father Hidalgo kind of nationalizing, or that nationalism and unifying through the Catholic Church. Then you've got the fighting phase, and then finally this phase where they get to independence. You don't need to know these names, but again, these Creoles are the leaders. And so you essentially had this guy who was working for the Spanish government, was going out to put out the revolution. He's going to join with the guerrilla leader who was kind of leading this revolution. And so this, from an American perspective, would be like if a British general joined forces with George Washington. So big shift in things. The weird thing is when this happens for Mexico, when they unify their forces, they call it the Army of the Three Guarantees. So what were the three guarantees? Well, when a new Mexico was created, they said what they want after independence from Spain was to put in place an absolute monarchy, which is interesting, um, where a European would still be in charge, or someone related to Napoleon, which is really odd. But they're saying we're going to have that person come to Mexico and be a ruler of kind of over us, kind of trying to put some of the chaos, like a reign of terror, kind of taking place in France. Similar thing happened here. So if we can have a monarch, that would put things back in place. But we want an absolute monarchy, but we also want a guarantee of equal rights. So there's a contradiction there. Um, and this is the big thing the Creoles had wanted, and certainly would help the lower class to a lesser degree, but it would still help them. So that's a very enlightened idea. But then it also says we want the Roman Catholic Church to be the state religion, and we don't want to affect that in a negative way at all, which is the opposite of freedom of religion. So again, you see this contradiction in Mexico between, yes, we have these Enlightenment ideas, but we also want to have an absolute monarchy. We also want to have a state religion. That goes with the need for unity and helping people find common ground, that nationalism, but also still wanting some enlightenment. So that's the interesting thing about Mexico. And this would be the embrace at Octopem, and this is the two leaders kind of joining forces. So this would be like, your British general, in this case a Spanish general, joining forces with the guerrilla leader and forming that army of the three guarantees. So recapping here, we have the area of colonialism. We've got where Spain's going to rule over Mexico for 300 years, all about that mercantilism, all about extracting resources. That really hurts the economy of Mexico, but also hurts Spain. Then they're going to become independent thanks to Father Hidalgo. But once they become independent, Mexico's going to struggle for decades. It's a really chaotic territory. Yes, Mexico has thrown off the imperialism of Spain, but now they've got to deal with the imperialism of the United States, which is going to take half of their land, first with Texas and then with the Spanish-American War, or sorry, excuse me, the Mexican-American War. And while all that's going on, Mexico is going through dozens of presidents, sometimes four, five, six presidents in the same year. Real big era of chaos. France is going to try and take over Mexico at one point. So really chaotic period. That's going to come to an end when this guy named Porfirio Diaz is going to take power. And he takes power through a military coup, so kind of similar to a Napoleon here. Again, not a very enlightened idea. And when he comes to power, he will then become elected, but the elections aren't really free and fair. He gets reelected like times or something. And while the idea of a dictatorship can be really scary, for Mexico at this time, it was a time of stability that they had never seen before. Since independence, they'd never had that much stability from the ruler. So this was a very positive thing. The downside is it's very authoritarian, and so you're not seeing a lot of the things implemented that people might want. One nice thing about him that was enlightened was he would use this group called cientificos, which is scientists. And these scientists were not so much in like experimenting with like biology or chemistry, but in things like economics and figuring, okay, what's the best way we can run this government? Again, a big enlightenment idea there. And the thing that's going to make him unpopular with a lot of people is he really allowed foreigners, particularly Americans, as in the United States, to invest in Mexico, buy large stakes of land, buy oil reserves, those kind of things. And that investment helps the economy grow, but it also puts more power in the hands of people that weren't Mexican. And we're also going to see this large growing gap between the rich and the poor. So this is going to be kind of what's going to set the groundwork for the revolution, which you're going to be studying in this project.